Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to this webinar where we're going to be learning on what really works to influence changes in policy. I'm really delighted to have you all here, and thanks so much for giving up your precious lunch times to join us today. Just to say, my name's Catherine Rake from Lucid Consultancy, and we work to support organisations with their strategy, their collaboration, and their learning. And on that point about learning, I think there's a very human tendency to focus on what went wrong, but we spend less time thinking about what went right. And actually, today we've got one of the big victories of 2025, which is the abolition of the two-child limit. And we wanted to put a spotlight on what went right because we think there's a huge amount for campaigners and those trying to influence government policy in whatever organisation they're working for. There's a huge amount that they could learn from what went right in that campaign. So it's going to be a warts and all expose of the campaign. We're going to talk about some of the challenges as well. But one of the other reasons we wanted to spotlight it is because we did a series of interviews last summer with chief executives of social change organisations, and an awful lot of things that they talked about, ingredients for success of campaigns, are reflected in this campaign. So the role of engaging people who are most affected is one of the things that we're going to cover off today. How you work between insider and outsider roles, and how you build a big coalition of organisations to support your campaign. And everybody engaged in this webinar will also be sharing their tips at the very end. So they're kind of top tips for you on the call at the end. So I'm going to start off. We're still waiting for one of our speakers to join us, but we thought we'd get going anyway. I'm going to start off by asking the speakers to introduce themselves, and then please do also, we can't see you, but we know there are a range of amazing people from amazing organisations across the webinar, so please do introduce yourselves as the speakers introduce themselves. Do introduce yourselves in the chat button. And for those of you that haven't been in Zoom for a little while, there's also a Q&A button, and we will be asking our speakers questions. There'll be a section for Q&A, so do flag any questions that you've got for our speakers in the Q&A button as well. So Jo, Rachel, and I believe Sophie is just about to join us, but is catching her breath. So Jo and Rachel, do you want to introduce yourselves, who you are, what brought you to the campaign, and also, did you do anything to celebrate the victory? It would be brilliant to hear about that.
So, do you want to go first, Rachel?
Sure, I can. Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel. I am the coalition manager for the End Child Poverty Coalition. And what brought me to this campaign is many years ago, I was working for Oxfam on food poverty, and it was when the two-child limit was introduced. And I remember just being furious about this policy coming in, and especially around the rape clause, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but when women have to disclose they're raped to get an exemption from it. And I just remember asking Oxfam, like, why aren't we campaigning on this? And the reply was, well, we don't really talk about benefits, we're sort of trying to stay away from that. And I just remember feeling sort of outraged that this was allowed to happen and that big organizations like Oxfam were sort of not letting it happen, but there wasn't much of a fight from a wide variety of sector organizations on this. So it always just stayed with me. And then when this job came up at the End Child Poverty Coalition, I think one of the really important ways that you can view poverty is through the eyes and experiences of children, because it becomes a really emotive issue. And then when you look at the two-child limit in relation to the impact that it has on children, it's kind of a no-brainer that it's just a very cruel policy that needs to be scrapped. And it just became, it made me remember how I felt when it had first been introduced, and I really wanted to work on it to highlight it once again. And I actually work from home the majority of time from my kitchen. I sit at my kitchen table and look out on my garden. And when the two-child limit, we thought it was going to be scrapped in the budget, I went into the office to be with other colleagues because this has been such a collaborative effort in order to scrap it. And it just felt right to be with other people whilst we could listen to the Chancellor say that it was going to be scrapped. And then we all shed a tear as it happened because it was such an emotional issue and an emotional time. That's it from me. Joe, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Joe. I'm the chair, the current chair of End Child Poverty Coalition. I'm also the chief executive of Buttle UK, a grant maker supporting children and young people in poverty and crisis. So in terms of my engagement, I mean, you know, when I became chair of the coalition, I mean, the opportunity actually to support this campaign kind of came through to us, didn't it, Rachel, where a group of organisations had started a campaign called All Kids Count. And they weren't so sure how much further they could take it and felt that more could be done with it within a coalition. And so we took it on, and at a time where it really was felt like I'm not sure what we can do about this at all. And it's interesting, like really interesting to hear Rachel's kind of personal views on it there, because we've not discussed that at all, Rachel. And it is personal. Like this is a personal thing to so many of us, and I connect back to it so much to when I was a teenager on free school meals, and I'm a third child, and we didn't get loads of support from from Social Security, but we all got it, whatever we did, whatever we did get. And if that was me in the world today, like I wouldn't have got that support, and I think that is absolutely wrong. And that's what we've been trying to change. So it is really interesting how there's real tangible stuff here of like, how do you get something passed over, maybe in this case, but also personally, this is really important to many of us here, important to Rachel and I. And I will use that also to hand to Sophie in a sec, because what did I do to celebrate? I was actually at a conference, so I kind of got all the news a bit later. I'd just spoken to Rachel, and Rachel said to me, listen to Rachel Reeves' speech. It's absolutely amazing. Like, it was almost something that we could have written for her. And so I did. I watched it on playback and was like, this is amazing. And actually, then we also spoke to a minister that, like, probably 20 minutes after that as well, Rachel. And that engagement still with a minister so close to that speech being made, which we appreciated a lot as well. Anyway, I will pass over to Sophie on this one too.
Hello everyone, I hope you can hear us all right. Sorry about the hustle and bustle. It's like the bell's about to go for lunch, so everyone's running around. But yeah, hello, my name's Sophie Barmer. I'm a young person who knows too much what policies like this was set out to, I guess, like hinder in a sort of way. Like, I'm a young person who grew up in poverty in a single parent household with with three siblings in the house, which, this is what the policy was set out to attack. It was who got the least sort of, I guess the word is who was punished by it, I guess. I'm just a young person who talks about what it's like. I'm a bit older now, I'm 22, I've got a job and all this sort of stuff, but it doesn't take away the feelings of what it's like to actually be a young person in these sort of situations. And in terms of where I was when I got the news, it was actually a really emotional day for me. As much as my family were not affected directly by the 2-child limit, we were like a big family, and the policy came in just a year after my sister would have been qualified. So we're on the cusp. We're very aware of it in my community because so many of my mom's friends and people I know are affected by it. But anyways, I remember I was at home and my mom was like, bear in mind, like, my mom is not politically inclined, doesn't really get in touch with the policy side of things. And I'll never forget the day she came in and was like, you read this, you read this. And it was Rachel Reeves was doing her speech. And for me, that was just a monumental day because it had connected with, my family aren't that political or anything, but they connected with it. And I remember my mom being really upset about it and stuff, and being like, oh, I just can't believe it. And more than me, it just made us so happy for the next generation who don't have to constantly be punished and feel like they're doing something wrong because they've got siblings, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you, all three of you, for those fantastic introductions. So to start with, a bit of setting the scene. In a nutshell, what's the campaign story? And Rachel, could you just explain to us what is the two-child limit, just in case people don't know what it is for those on the call, and set the scene in terms of what the campaign was?
Yeah. So the two-child limit is a really complicated, quite knotty policy that was brought in under the last Conservative government. And if a family claim universal credit payments, so if they are in receipt of benefit payments, you get what's called a child element for your children on that, which now is around about £3,500 per child. If you are impacted by the two-child limit, you don't get that money for the third, fourth, or fifth, or however many children you have after two. So the child element is capped. It's only for children who are born after April 2017. So that's why Sophie's family aren't impacted by it. But it does mean that you are getting children today who are impacted, who are very young, babies, for example, as well,
Yeah.
because it affects newborn children that are the third or more child into a family. And the idea behind the policy was that it was brought in during this time of austerity around the narrative of like benefit street and that sort of like awful rhetoric around who poor people were and like that everything was their fault and therefore we needed to punish them for having children. And if you can't be sensible and plan how many children you have, then this is going to sort of like put an end to it. And that policy has remained in place, and it is also still relatively popular with the public who still sort of buy into the narrative around who is to blame. The really important thing to remember, though, is that 1 in 9 children across the whole of the UK is impacted by the two-child limit. I think people think that perhaps it's sort of like one larger family in every community, but it's not. It's 1 in 9 children. And for every day that the policy is in place, it pulls 109 children into poverty. It is a driver, one of the biggest, if not the biggest driver of child poverty in the UK. And we've always been super clear that if a government wants to tackle child poverty, the first step they have to take is to scrap this policy, because whatever else you would try and do on top of that would never be successful if this policy is just continuously pulling more kids into poverty. So it is the policy, the first step to addressing child poverty, this has to go. And that was our message and our campaign, that the two-child limit had to be scrapped for all families and for all people impacted. It couldn't sort of go as a kind of half measure. You can't leave some kids in poverty whilst taking others out. So across the campaign and the coalition, that was our message, that all kids count, and the two-child limit had to be scrapped for all families.
Okay, and if you could, a bit of an introduction to the coalition, because it's an amazing collection of organisations, and a bit of an introduction in terms of your work with youth ambassadors, of whom Sophie is one.
Yep. So the coalition is now 140 different organisations, and it's a really broad church. So it's not just organisations that focus specifically on child poverty, but we've got religious organisations, trade unions, all sorts of different groups, both national and smaller regional and local charities too. So like individual baby banks and individual food banks will be members. And I know that lots of our members are actually listening. So there's lots of people on the call who are members. And we realised that although we have this broad membership, we didn't necessarily have any direct contact with young people who were experiencing poverty. So when I first started in the role, we developed a youth ambassador group, which is now 20 young people who all have personal experience of growing up in a low-income family. And as part of their role is to guide the coalition and, you know, ensure that what we're working on is of relevance to them and their lives.
Jo, from the position of chair, anything to add in terms of context and the story? And Sophie, having been one of those youth ambassadors, anything you'd want to add before we get into the meat of the conversation?
Yeah, just quickly, you know, the coalition has been around since 2003, and it was kind of in a response, in a sense, to kind of keep the pressure up against, almost against and supporting the government that had set out to eradicate child poverty. And of course, that continues. But we still, in sense of our purpose, and Rachel was talking about the importance of young people. That is, how we do things is to involve young people, and that's very much in our purpose. But we also share knowledge as a coalition because we've got such a great amount of expertise across this coalition of 140 plus. And then all come together to create that change as well. Sophie, I'll let you say about youth ambassadors.
Yeah, there's not really much more to add in terms of what youth ambassadors are, but I'd just say it's like a really, in these sort of conversations, you'd think that the people who were at the forefront, who was given so much information to these arguments and these policy changes and all these meetings that you can imagine, you'd be surprised it's never young people. I mean, a lot of you will know this, but it's never the young people that are actually affected that are the ones sitting there being like, no, this is how it is. And as much as organizations can be amazing for what they're fighting for, you've just got to remember, like, things change, what you're fighting for and how that feels changes every year. So yeah, I've done some amazing stuff with as a youth ambassador, and I think it's just a really positive, supportive environment for young people to share their story and be involved in more ways than just like, sitting on the webinar and stuff. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so that's the first issue that we're going to dive more deeply into, which is about how you've worked to absolutely centre the voices of young people in this campaign, make sure that their voices are heard, but they also get to shape the way their campaign works. So I know, Rachel and Sophie, you've been really working on this together. So how's that worked?
Sophie, I was going to ask you, how do you feel about working on a campaign like this that, as you said, like doesn't directly impact your family, but is obviously something that's really important to you? So, I guess, why did you get involved, and like, how do you feel that you've been able to campaign on this with us?
Yeah, I think obviously someone who, as I've just said, people who are affected by it, maybe a lot of the young people who are affected by the two-child limit are obviously a lot younger than me. But I think for me, it's like I wanted to get involved because, as Rachel kind of briefly mentioned before, these ideas, stereotypes, and what people believe families like mine, individuals like me, people like my mom are just so incorrect and so like damaging and not very nice as a young person to hear or feel. So when you hear people debate about the policy like this before it was scrapped, it was like so many people talking about big families and presuming they know everything about you and your life and your story. So that's mainly why I got involved, because I was like, this isn't how it is. Like, this is, I know what it's like to be from a big family who are struggling, and it's not, it's not these programs that are designed or these media articles that people run with. It's nothing like that. So that's mainly why I got involved. In terms of how it's been involved in it, I mean, it is incredible to be able to speak from and say what I want to say. And it's not like, something's no big agenda, well, apart from getting it scrapped. But that's obviously the main reason. But it was about like talking and just really changing the viewpoint of like, okay, you're thinking of this very big policy, what affects, like, as Rachel said, 1 in 9. But if you spoke to a young person who, like, bring it back to earth and make sure that these statistics aren't just something you get a bit lost in and you just say, oh yeah, it is 1 in 9. But if you think about it and listen, you spoke to every 1 in 9 there was, like, think about how many young people that is and how many stories and experiences, and more than anything, how they feel. So yeah, if that answers your question.
Thank you, Sophie. And I don't like involving young people is so central to this work, and not just young people, but families with personal experience of the policy. So we've worked really closely with several mums who've been really quite courageous in speaking out about the impact that the two-child limit has had on their family. One of them is a mum who, her child was born a month after the policy came in. So she's literally lived with this policy the whole time that it's been in place. And she talks about how when her baby was 6 weeks old, she had to go back to work because she just couldn't afford the basics, and the strain that then put on her relationship with her children and her baby, and how she felt that she was missing out on key moments. And I think that helps bring to life to decision makers why this policy needs to go. And you can talk about numbers, but when you talk about the personal stories, it gets harder to ignore the impact that it's having on people. And it helps win the argument, but it also ensures that I'm not in a room talking about something that doesn't directly impact me, and that I'm bringing people with me who have that experience to share. I'm not talking on behalf of somebody, I'm talking with them. And, in everything that we try and do, that's the approach that we try and take. And obviously, we don't always get it right, and there's loads more that we could be doing that's better. But it feels like the young people and the mums that we work with are campaigners in their own right. They're not, and I really hate this phrase, like the media come and say, do you have any case studies of people who will speak to us about this issue? And I'm like, well, I mean, we have people that we work with who are impacted, but they work with us from the beginning and they're involved from the beginning. And we don't want people to feel like case studies. We want them to feel like they're working alongside us, because that's how you involve people. And it's not this sort of like tokenistic gesture that comes right at the end when you say, oh, now we need a case study to illustrate what we're talking about. So that's kind of the approach that we've taken. And because this campaign, for example, doesn't necessarily touch the life of all of the youth ambassadors, we, as part of the campaign, more broadly, we give space and time for youth ambassadors to come together and tell us what is important. And then we also campaign on that as well alongside this work. So we make sure that we are, involving young people in all sorts of ways in this work.
And it
Can I
sounds as
just
though,
add?
yeah, please do, Joe.
Just because it has, when we talked about how we celebrate, that actually when we celebrate, I immediately thought about the amazing young people, and often mums that really put their head above the parapet. Like, we can do that as organizations because that's our job, like, and actually sometimes organizations struggle to put their head above the parapet as well. But like, what I really saw and what I have seen is that individuals have really put themselves out there, and we will support those we work with to do that in the safest way. And there are some individuals we don't work with, and it isn't safe. Like, there has been some real vitriol against those individuals that do step up, and we have to remember that is incredibly amazing that they still continue to do that, and to this day they're still continuing to do it as well.
And there's a really strong theme here about both the direct impact in terms of their campaign, but also some of the ripple effects that set in train in terms of educating other institutions that might not be as kind of tuned into this need of engaging people who are really affected, and also about growing a kind of next generation of campaigners. Sophie, Rachel, Joe, I don't know if you've got any reflections on not only the direct but some of those ripple effects that this work has had as well.
I would just say, like, in terms of ripple effect, I think an important thing to like note as well is like the individual who's campaigning. Like, as Joe said, like, I mean, it's not been easy. I've had some awkward conversations for someone who's so young, and had some awful like responses which are not nice for anyone, and no one should be subjected to that. But there's also been a whole world of positives, and the ripple effect for me not only is like helping other young ambassadors to come up, because I feel like the grandma now because I'm getting a bit older, but is the fact that it's changed my life as well. And I think, people like me don't get to sit in them sort of rooms, and like I'll go back and I'll feel so weird because I'll be like, oh, I'm back to where I'm from, but last week I was in Downing Street, or this sort of thing. And I think for me, the ripple effect, if it's done correctly, which is a really important thing to know, is the young person who's doing it, or the parent, or whatever, the confidence, the experiences. I wouldn't be sitting like, no, I went to uni and stuff, and took a bit of a conventional path out of social mobility, but I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't have been put in these spaces and being taught, like, yeah, you've been through that, but that matters, and like, you need to be in these spaces, you deserve to be in policy, in politics, and all that sort of stuff. So, and I hope that's a ripple effect that goes on to other young people in my life, and my sisters, and people that I know. That's what I take away from it the most. But yeah,
the meetings that we have, the buildings that we go into, the speaking to the Chancellor, which is something that we've just done very recently, and Sophie spoke, going to the House of Commons. I mean, to get into the House of Commons, as everyone I'm sure knows, you have to go past people with huge guns. You know, it's intimidating, whether or not you are from a low income background or not. But these are not places that are designed to be open and accessible. And I hope with the Youth Ambassador program that we are opening up those spaces, obviously not to lots and lots of young people, but just to a few. And we're creating this like next generation of young people who come from a low income family, but don't see like the charity sector or politics necessarily as like something that is not available to them. And obviously that this is broader than the two-child limit campaign, but to show how a young person's input into a project can affect such monumental change, I really hope that that demonstrates to youth ambassadors kind of exactly why we need them and what their power is in a way that hasn't happened previously or doesn't always happen. And we open up these spaces to them. So I hope you don't mind me saying this, Sophie, but we went to for a reception at 11 Downing Street with the Chancellor. And when we went in, like, you know, it was quite an impressive room. And we were, oh my goodness, all of us were sort of a bit overwhelmed by it. But Sophie was specifically saying, you know, I haven't ever been anywhere that's quite like this before. And I think that that was like, that's really important that we need to take more young people to places like that because both Rachel Reeves needs to know that that's not accessible to young people, but young people need to know that they are welcome and should be in those spaces as much as me as a campaigner. You know, Sophie should be there too. So yeah, so that's what we're trying to do with this program, I think.
And Rachel, we have had conversations about whether we attend these places if a young person can't. You know, we think about like if you're listening, think about how many times when you get invited to these spaces, you go, or you say, no, I'm not going to go because a young person needs to go either in my place or alongside me. And if they're not, then maybe I don't go. You know, sometimes it's the right thing to go still, but not every time. And quite a lot of times we do go. And let me say, at number 11, Rachel Reeves didn't care about what I was saying. She cared about what Sophie was saying.
Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for that really fascinating description. And I think, you know, that kind of reflection as well in terms of the terms of engagement with some of those institutions, overwhelming institutions, as you brilliantly described them. So the next bit it would be really good to dive a bit deeper into is this whole insider-outsider balance and how you work with a government that on where members of it, MPs will be saying, we're hugely sympathetic to your cause, come and talk to us, come and chat with us, come and advise us behind the scenes, with the need to bring the public alongside you and to make some noise. And you use some fantastic old-fashioned campaigning stunts as well through the course of the campaign and really wanted to make some noise about it. And this also came through those interviews and is in one of our tips in terms of being really intentional about that insider-outsider track and which you choose and how you balance across those two. So your reflections in terms of how that worked through the campaign, insider-outsider tactics.
I'll kick us off, Rachel, just in my thought. We have to remember that the campaign goes across governments and some are more open to listening to us than others, I think, with that. And, you know, that's where some of the external side of things and where we're trying to highlight, you know, a lot of this is, yes, of course, about governments, but it's about public narrative as well. And we just talked, you know, we've talked about the stigma that we need to change around poverty here as well. So I think some of these stunts and everything as well is some of that external pressure stuff that we, you know, every anniversary we were out there saying, you know, this is an unhappy birthday essentially as well. Mm-hmm. And fantastic ideas from Rachel on that. But then, you know, where we came into the probably, you know, the last few years, yes, there's that closer kind of piece to it, but also there's the close and supportive, and there's the close and kind of supportive but challenging as well. And whether we have that, you know, external challenging, because actually that's kind of what the government wants to, because the public need to hear how outrageous this two-child limit, to actually hear about it in the first instance anyway. Because this doesn't affect all of the public's lives, and they need to understand why this is outrageous, that it pulls children into poverty every day. And then, and this is still, it goes on and on. It is still going on with the child poverty strategy as well. You know, we need to keep close, and we need to do things that are behind closed doors and support and have those conversations and bring things forwards that we may then take out into the external domain as well. But that there is that, you know, close and then extended. But currently it's about giving a bit of a heads up of what might we do externally, but having a relationship there, that is, you know, it is a relationship. Rachel.
From a very practical point of view as well, some of our members are sort of more insider than not, and some are much more outsider than not. And it's just sort of how they are as organizations. And from a practical point of view, whenever we do anything, we unless we're like individually naming organizations in support, we say we're a coalition of 140 organizations who think that you should scrap the two-child limit, for example, which means that we don't need to kind of get all our tactics or messaging approved by everyone in the coalition. We know that organizations will proactively support what we're doing if they can, publicly, but it's not a requirement that everybody has to. And I think one of the big learnings for me in all of this has been the ability to just let go of control. So our message was around scrapping the two-child limit for everyone. And we even had the name, you know, All Kids Count. I would say the vast majority of coalition members never used that as the campaign name, but they did all say, we want the two-child limit to be scrapped for all children. And they did it in their own way. So UNICEF, for example, write a report every year on the child poverty and compare it to between different countries, and they focused in the UK on the two-child limit, you know, because of the work that we had done. And Little Village, the baby bank group in London, had scrapping the two-child limit as their manifesto ask, alongside a couple of different asks. At no point did either of those mention the campaign name, but it's fine, you know. And that to me has been a real learning point, is that you just don't need to control everything. And when you have a coalition that's 140 organizations, you have to kind of trust that some people will be doing the insider, speaking directly to ministers and saying we want it scrapped, and then you have others who will do big public stunts, and you sort of have to let go of that a bit in order to make the campaign a success.
Brilliant. Sophie, what were your reflections, insider, outsider, and how you saw that operate?
I'm not too sure, to be fair. I kind of just echo what Rachel says about, like, sort of, it is sometimes odd to see, like, when you do a lot of work and you recommend a lot of things, and then it's kind of like, oh, but it's not really like, you know, you don't get like credit. It's not like, oh, I'm well done for this sort of thing. So that part of is hard to see, but it's, you know, it's how it is, and it's it's just about working. What's the word? Like cleverly is not a word, but working well about it, sort of thing. You get what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely, working for the goal rather than for the organisation or the name. And Joe, for you as chairing this coalition of 140, slightly mind-boggling numbers, were there times when that kind of discipline was tested a little bit? Because there's a classic tactic from government, which is you start pulling one or two organisations in to say, oh, actually, we can't quite do what you want, but here's a compromise. You know, could you back it? Did you have those sorts of hairy moments or similar moments where the kind of internal discipline of the coalition was tested?
I think actually, when you talk about the kind of internal, external, on the internal, like, it kind of goes both ways as well, where, you do have that, you know, we've had that engagement from kind of civil servants, essentially, kind of saying that this is how we're hearing it on the inside too. Is this how you're meaning to communicate it? Where you might have a little bit of those discrepancies going on, and actually that's really, really helpful, because it helps us to say, okay, how are things communicated? How can we bring this back again as well? And you know, Rachel said it, the most amazing thing about the ask that we had was that it was such a spearhead of an ask. It was like, we're going to push for this, and nobody can pull us apart on that point. And coalition members all went in on that spearhead point of drop the 2-child limit, and then detail can come underneath that as well. That was an incredible thing to hold, and at times where that was possibly like, oh, is that not holding? We could bring it back again as well as a coalition. So
Brilliant. And building on this whole theme about coalitions, so again, a really strong theme that's emerging from campaigning now is does appear that people are really waking up to this fact that you are stronger together. So tell us more about, why work in coalitions? What are the benefits, and how did you see those materializing through this latest campaign?
I mean, I think it's what we've said, that the benefit is that you have organisations at sort of every level saying the same message to government. So you have those organisations that have the direct meetings with ministers saying it, and then you have the individual baby banks saying it, and you have organisations that aren't necessarily known for talking about child poverty saying it. And so the message is sort of getting through in many different ways. And just to reflect a bit on what Joe was saying a minute ago, it could have been very easy to come with a compromise position on the 2-child limit. Could have been very easy to say, oh, let's scrap it for some and not all, and then do it in a different way later on. But publicly and privately, like I said at the beginning, you can't ask for less when it comes to children. And the organisations did during this whole process, and they were not members of the coalition. And it was really amazing, actually, how, as a coalition, publicly and privately, the message was just getting through that it had to be for all families. And the organisations that were saying, oh, maybe you could do it in a phased approach, for example, I think wanted to be seen to be more pragmatic or more realistic to government. But because we were such a force behind it, it meant that there was sort of a big wall of opposition for that position, which I think was a real success.
I was going to add just that, in terms of coalition working, and it's something Rachel and I think about quite a lot is, where there's there's expertise that's needed in an area that we just don't have that in our coalition. We have a heck of a lot of expertise across the coalition, but we've really tried to kind of almost invite organisations in as well, of like, you bring such expertise, whether that's on a local level or on a national level. We get asked some of these questions, and we're not actually experts on it, but we might have to talk about it, and we don't want to do that. And so, as much as that's why we want to engage young people as well, because they have such expertise, we also have organisations, and I really kind of shout out to the smaller organisations, but fantastic organisations leading locally that can give us real insights as well. And also as spokespeople, where quite often I think Buttle's been really helpful for me on this too, where I'm not like a policy guy, really. We've got amazing policy people throughout this. But when people really, with the narrative, and people want to know what's happening out there on the ground, I'm able to say about that from Buttle's perspective of the amount of grants that we deliver all across the UK. But we also have a number of organisations that absolutely are living this every day. And, that diversity of voice is amazing.
Brilliant. So there was one other on the coalition, which was this issue about Too Political and the Charity Commission and the Lobbying Act, and people's awareness of that. Any reflections on how you negotiated position for the coalition and for organisations around that?
Yeah, so we have to be really careful because coalition activity can count towards individual organisational budgets when it comes to campaigning during elections. And Also, the two-child limit became a really political issue during the general election, and it became this sort of divisive issue where candidates were asked which side do they fall to kind of describe whether they were sort of right or left leaning. Um, I mean, I don't think I've ever worked on an issue that's been talked about in leaders' debates in the way that this was. It was really quite incredible to kind of see it blow up during that time, but also quite frustrating that then we weren't able to do much on it ourselves because we had to sort of take a step back and not be seen to be working on to not be working on this as such. I think one of the things that sort of inadvertently, and it wasn't planned at all, but really helped, was that we have local child poverty data that we have produced every year for each constituency. And then I was also able to produce statistics on the number of children who are impacted by the two-child limit in each constituency. So although we weren't necessarily directly able to talk about this as such, all candidates of any party could get hold of that data to be able to use that information. And again, it was never attributed back to us, which is totally fine. It was actually really good to just spread it, but it meant that all candidates were able to, if they wanted to, use child poverty data and the two-child limit data in whichever way they wanted, which was really helpful in terms of keeping the message going during the general election campaign.
Brilliant. Okay, so we've got some questions popping up in the Q&A box, which I'm going to come to in a second, but I just want to start the kind of Q&A session, if that's okay, just by asking you, if you were to have your time again, is there anything that you would do differently in this campaign? Sorry, it's a tricky question, so I don't know who's going to be the brave person to volunteer, but anything you do differently if you were to have your time again?
I'm just thinking about the changes over time, Rachel. Because it's been a long campaign. We talk about policy change influencing. It takes a long time, and actually, it's been amazing because we have seen that change. I mean, it doesn't happen all of the time so quickly in that way as well. I kind of contradict myself. I I feel like we've done as much as we could do in it, in a sense. We've kept it live. I think there are elements around our engagement with what was then a kind of Labour government of what this can mean in the longer term. But I think in this shorter term, it's been a real roller coaster, Catherine. I wish we could have, if I did it again, almost like take a track that 2 years before almost just be like, right, this argument's won and we can just go for this, and it's happened. But like literally up until the day, we didn't know if it was going to get dropped in full. And so I don't know, doing things differently, you're having to react to so much. In that last year and a half, it was so up and down that I don't think we could plan anything differently to that. It was like, how do you stop that happening? It was so up and down.
And there is something, isn't there, about just keeping plugging away. And as you say, changing your tactics, reflecting. But I mean, a lot of campaigning is just about carrying on, showing up, waving the flag. Rachel, Sophie, anything else that you would do differently if you would have your time again?
Well, it's so tricky because there's just been so many parts to this work. I mean, there's loads of learnings that I'm taking from all of this, and I think that it would have been really great to involve more families from the get-go who are directly impacted by the two-child limit. It's really hard to do this because sometimes they don't know that they're impacted, and also because quite rightly they are worried about sticking their head above the parapet. So just trying to create an environment in which they felt more able to contribute would have been a good start, I think. So that's something I would do differently again. And I think it's a bit of a strange one actually, but I think some of the biggest moments that we had where we felt as the campaign that we were achieving something were when we all came together and did something visual, like a stunt,
Yeah.
and actually doing more of that to kind of bring us together as a group would have been really good, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sophie, anything from you?
I'd say yeah, maybe the more creative side and getting more people involved. You could say about most campaigns, even if they end up being successful. I think overall, I mean, personally, I think I put in what I could, and I know that Joseph and Rachel and everyone else works really hard. So this question's a bit of a difficult one because I don't think anything. Everyone reacted how they could with what we had, and like
Yeah.
at the beginning, no one really wanted to hear these conversations and everything. So it was. I think we did what we can. So yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so Sophie, I've actually got a question for you that's come through in chat. It says, Sophie, it sounds like you've had an amazing impact. Huge congratulations, quite right. Was there anything that was particularly challenging for you or other panelists getting involved?
Well, I think on a level that could be applied to everyone. It is hard to put, as Rachel keeps mentioning, it's hard to be the person to be like, well, this isn't very right, because it does make you vulnerable and it makes you, subjected to a lot of difficult conversations. But I'd say for me, the uneasy part about this campaign, and I guess also beyond, is just it isn't easy being a young person involved with this sort of stuff. Like I wish it was all like fairy tale and rainbows, and I get a good few things from my CV and my LinkedIn out of this. But at the end of the day, I'm not someone who can just do things not working. The time that I take out is, luckily with this campaign that I do, is paid. But obviously, I'm really lucky. I'm not a young carer. I'm not all like I don't have like major commitments that meant I could be like quite involved in some of this stuff and could do things last minute. But I think it's important to mention, in terms of the things that I found challenging, was obviously going against any stereotype or sort of policies, never like the most comfortable. But more than anything, I think I guess it's, there's loads of times I'd show up to like meetings and stuff, and I'd worked the night shift the night before, and I was a bit, I was always saying to Rachel, oh, I just feel a bit whatever. So, but this, I don't feel sorry for myself. Like I did what I did because I care about it. But I think it's important to know, when you're looking at campaigns, the young people who got involved, you sacrifice a lot, and it's not as simple as it looks like ticking a box for lived experience. So yeah.
Definitely. Okay, brilliant. And there's actually a follow-on question that's just popped into chat about creating safety for people engaging in the campaign, and what worked to reduce the risks, and how did you create that environment of safety for your youth ambassadors and other people who are directly affected by the issue? Rachel, Joe, do you want to come in?
It's really difficult actually, because I think as we've been working on this, the media landscape has really changed, and it's quite vicious now in a way that potentially it wasn't at the beginning. Um, so, and it's also really hard because you want these stories to get into publications to speak to people who aren't always on your side. So you've always got to balance this, like, rightly so, keeping people safe versus allowing people to tell their story to people that maybe, not completely disagree, but maybe on the fence when it comes to this issue. And so we had a mum called Taya, who was working on this, who had a opinion piece written about her specifically in the Daily Mail, and they didn't interview her. They just pulled bits that she had talked about from lots of different publications and printed this awful piece. They used a picture of her on social media, like, this horrendous mum who has 3 kids and is talking about this, and it's awful what happened to her, and it really has made me think about keeping people safer, but that balance between talking to people who don't agree with you, and it's a really hard one to strike. And I don't think we necessarily have it right, but we always err on the side of safety. So I would never put a young person up for an interview that was potentially likely to be combative, and also always make sure that me or Joe or somebody is alongside them, because sometimes they can be asked really complicated policy questions as well, which obviously they might know the answer to, but it's not that they don't need to know the answer to it. So just making sure that you're kind of providing that as well. And in terms of safety in MP meetings, So we've done some training with youth ambassadors, and we're just about to do some more around thinking through like which parts of your story of your life do you want to share and which parts do you want to keep private. And actually, it's totally fine not to share stuff. So, for example, we've had a couple of different very high profile MPs and ministers sort of asking questions around like absent fathers and why that is the case, for example, and having to just let young people know that they don't need to answer questions like that, and that if there's somebody, you know, there will always be somebody like me in the room who can kind of take that on as a question to answer, and not feel that they have to say it. But it's really hard because it's that thing of authority asking you a question and you sort of feel like you have to give an answer. So it's definitely something that we're still working through. And you know, before this, we asked, is Sophie going to be on camera? You know, so that Sophie could make an informed choice about whether or not she wanted to take part, bearing in mind everything that was going to happen. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that I try and do behind the scenes to ensure that people are like completely informed, and also that they have thought through what the implications of doing something might be.
So space, Joe, Sophie, if you want to add anything in terms of that safety point.
I would just say the one thing that I think isn't like always deemed important in safety is like, I mean, Rachel kind of mentioned it, but it's like fully letting the young person understand what they're signing up for and what they're actually going to be doing. Because when I was a lot younger with different organizations, like once I went on ITV News and like I got told to dress a certain way and be a certain way and stuff, which was a very detrimental interview to me, because that doesn't just get a raise, like that will, I mean, it doesn't follow us, I'm not a celebrity, but you get what I mean, like that sort of stuff. Like, I didn't know what I was signing up for. I didn't know what the questions were going to be. No one was there with us. I was very like, you know, I got forced, kind of, I guess, coerced into something that I didn't really want to do. So I guess the big part of safety for me, that also, apart from safeguarding, is like making sure the young person knows what potential implications could be of doing that. Like, I didn't know that would go on the actual telly and everyone in my area would see it, sort of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you. So I've got a couple of questions about tactics, which I'm going to roll into one. There's one about, was this primarily one on evidence rather than public mobilisation, and what role, you know, was public mobilisation a minor part of it or a major part? And then a question about how did you change your tactics when there was a change in administration? So again, I'm not sure who wants to go first, but what about the tactics in terms of mobilisation of the public and evidence, and how you changed your tactics with the change in government?
So annoyingly, I think they're both really important. With this issue, it's quite clear that the two-child limit is pulling kids into poverty. So as soon as you get a government that says we want to tackle child poverty, this is the policy that has to go. It's like, but it's an obvious first step, and the evidence will always show that. Using the government's own measure of child poverty, this will show that this policy needs to go. So in that respect, I suppose the evidence is very strong, and we're really lucky to have such strong evidence. You know, there's a real clear positive correlation between the number of children living in poverty in an area and the amount of families impacted by the two-child limit. It's just such a clear driver. So when the government said in their manifesto they wanted to have an ambitious strategy to lift children out of poverty, you know, it was always going to have to be on the table. And public mobilization has been an interesting one, because when I'm just thinking back to like the peaks and troughs of this campaign. So the government came in and they said they wanted to address child poverty, but then almost immediately they went about trying to make cuts to the welfare bill and used quite a lot of rhetoric around, you know, the burgeoning welfare bill, it costs us all too much, which then made it very difficult to come back and do this work on the two-child limit, because the story that they were telling wasn't the one that needed to be told in order to ensure that the two-child limit sort of had the public support behind it. And as a coalition as well, we, as the coalition itself, don't have public support that comes from our members. So it's the people that support the individual organizations and how they choose to communicate with those people. But I think there has been a real tipping point in terms of the public understanding about what the policy is. So we were speaking the other day about how when we first started talking about it, like the only politician who was really saying anything on the two-child limit was Jeremy Corbyn. And even underneath that, people who followed him would be saying, oh, I don't know if I necessarily agree with this. Whereas now you have every single Labour MP has, put out an infographic saying this is how many children are going to be lifted out of poverty in my constituency because of this policy. And so there is a shift in narrative. Depending on who you ask and what survey you look at, it's likely that a large proportion of the population do still support the policy because we've been told for decades that, poor people are to blame and individual decisions are what makes families have lots of children and then fall into poverty. And so it will take lots of shift in narrative in order to change that. And, we argue that we can do some of that in the charity sector, but that does also have to come from the government as well, telling a different story about the need for benefit payments to support us all, and that actually having a welfare state that's well funded is a really important and positive thing. So there's still lots of work to be done on that in order to win round the public. But having that tipping point and having enough of the public supporting it, I think was really important in order to get it across.
Okay, so definitely an and.
Yes,
I'm really sorry because we have 3 minutes to go, which it means that I'm gonna ask you for a very last round, which is I originally said your 3 top tips, but maybe we could just have one from each of you. So if you were sat in the audience listening to this, what would be the really big tip that you would offer others in terms of running a successful campaign? So over to you. Who would like to go first?
I'll go first. I'll try and be different, Rachel, in some of it, because there's some really, there's some absolute tips, and I will definitely leave Rachel and Sophie with some of those. One thing I was really reflecting on, and particularly with the audience, is that they're, Buttle UK is a trust and foundation. And when I look at the coalition, so that we're in, the End Child Poverty Coalition, there aren't really any other trusts and foundations. And that's, we have a voice piece to trusts and foundations because they fund our work. But actually, many more trusts and foundations are doing a lot of this kind of change and influencing piece. So I've really put it out there. If you're thinking and you're thinking about child poverty and you're thinking about influence, absolutely join the coalition as well. I think there is a tip there around how do we come together a little bit more as well. I'll leave other things to Rachel and Sophie.
Sophie, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sorry. It's a very broad question, but I think for me, as a young person, I would just say that the top tip is just get young people involved and make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Like we're not a box to tick or a really cool thing you can put on the front of like a I don't know, annual report or something. Like this is like people's real lives and this is people's real stories, and make sure you're doing it for the right reasons and you do it right. You pay them, you make sure it's inclusive, and you get young people who are actually affected by these issues in the conversations, because like as I've said, like it not only changes the whole direction and makes your campaign so much stronger, it can also change their life as well. So yeah.
Brilliant. Last word to you, Rachel.
Oh no, I should have let you go last, Sophie. I mean, I think my top tip for campaigning in coalition, which is what I said earlier, is to have a broad church of organisations who are all calling for the same thing, and to make sure that you have a really sort of wide range of organisations working on different themes, all calling for the same thing, has been really impactful here. And for example, if you have a childcare coalition and all the organisations are childcare focused and they're all asking for the same thing, it's not really a surprise. Whereas this is a little bit more surprising to officials to see different organisations asking for this. And I think that the other sort of thing in relation to that is that if you're going to have a broad church, you have to be willing to let go of the message, which is what I was mentioning earlier. And the coalition, I should say, is I'm the only paid member of staff, so it's actually quite hard for me to sort of police what people are doing. So just being able to let go of the message and let organisations get on with their own work, factoring in what the coalition is calling for, again, I think has been really influential in this case.
And supporting the resource of our coalition as well, those organisations, has been amazing. So a big up to them as well.
Brilliant. Okay, well, fantastic. Thank you to all three of you for so generously sharing your time today, and to everybody that was in the audience. Brilliant questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer them all. We will be emailing you with a couple of resources that hopefully will be helpful for your campaigns, public, insider and outsider. We welcome it all. It's brilliant to see people working so hard for change that will make a massive difference to many, many people to come. And there are lots of questions about what's coming next. So I think you can all take from this more power to your collective elbows for continuing to fight this good fight and making sure that the victory, it's a very significant victory you've won, is held on to. So thank you again for your time today, and have a good rest of your afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking us to speak.